All right, buckle up, everybody, because today we're diving deep into something pretty cool. We're talking about Smoke, and it's this mobile messenger. But what makes it so special? Well, it's not your average texting app. Smoke uses something called the McEliece algorithm. And get this, it's supposed to be resistant to, like, even quantum computers.
Yeah, and that's a really big deal because as we move, closer and closer to this future where quantum computers could become like a reality, a lot of our traditional encryption methods might not cut it anymore. So Smoke is exploring this potential solution by using McEliece for, your everyday mobile messaging.
Okay, so back up for a sec. What exactly is this McEliece algorithm? And why is everybody making such a fuss about it?
So imagine like a secret code that's so complex that even the most powerful computers we can think of would have a really hard time cracking it. That's the promise of McEliece. It's like this shield that's been evolving over time. And with each version, or what they call modulus, it adds like layers of protection. It's like a constantly upgrading security system for our messages. I like that. So let's start with like the OG Modulus 1. Like where did this whole thing even begin?
Okay, so Modulus 1, this is the classic McEliece system. It was developed by a guy named Robert McEliece back in 1978. So picture this. You have a message you want to send. You want to make sure that only the person you're sending it to can read it. So you use this thing called a GOPA code.
Okay, hold on. GOPA code. What is that? Like some kind of secret language or something?
So think of a GOPA code, like a really complex maze, right? It's a mathematical structure that lets you scramble your message in a very specific way. And only someone with, like, the right map, which we call the private key, can navigate that maze and unscramble the message.
So it's like sending a treasure map, but only the recipient with the right key can actually decipher it. Okay, now I'm seeing why this is cool.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Within this GOPA code, there are these parameters. They're called M and T. And they're kind of like settings for the complexity of this maze, right? Okay, so M and T. They're like difficulty levels for the code. So what were the settings for like the classic McEliece system?
All right, so in the original version, McEliece set M to 11 and T to 50. And they chose those values to give a good level of security for the time. But you gotta remember, the world of cryptography, it's always changing.
Right, because the hackers are always trying to find like new ways to break codes, right?
Right.
So what happened next in this like McEliece saga? Enter Modulus 2.
Exactly. So in the 1990s, these Japanese researchers, Eiichiro Fujisaki and Tatsuaki Okamoto, they came up with Modulus 2. And they bumped up the M to 12 and T to 68. Essentially, they made the maze way more complex, harder to navigate without that key.
So they like cranked up the difficulty. But what was the reason for that? Like, were there specific weaknesses in Modulus 1 that they were trying to address?
Well, it's likely that they were, looking ahead, anticipating like advancements in computing power, trying to stay ahead of the curve because, increasing those parameters makes those brute force attacks where someone just tries every possible key combination way more difficult.
Okay, so it's like they knew the enemy was developing like more powerful siege weapons, so they had to reinforce the castle walls. But hold on a second. Didn't you say that? Like a higher M and T could actually make things slower.
Yeah, that's true. There's always this trade-off, right? Higher parameters, they do require more computational power, which could, slow down the encryption and decryption process. But keep in mind, technology's come a long way since those early days of McEliece.
Right, so it's like trying to strike that balance between security and performance. Okay, but we're not done with this McEliece evolution yet, right?
Yeah.
What about Modulus 3?
All right, so Modulus 3. This was developed by David Pointcheval from France. And here's the interesting thing. He actually went back to the original M of 11 and T of 50. But that doesn't mean it was like a step backward in security.
Wait, so they actually dialed back the difficulty. Why would they do that?
It kind of suggests that Modulus 3 might have focused on different kinds of improvements, right? Maybe they found more efficient ways to implement the algorithm, or they strengthen specific parts of the system's design. It's like reinforcing the castle walls with a new, stronger material, even if you're not making them any thicker.
Okay, so it's not always about brute force. It's about being smarter with the design itself. But wait a minute. We haven't even talked about Modulus 4, the one that Smoke actually uses. What's the deal with that one?
All right, so this is where things get really exciting. Smoke's developers, Textbrowser, they're using what they call Super McEliece, and they are not messing around with security. They've chosen significantly larger values for M and T, setting them at 13 and 118 respectively.
Whoa, those are some big numbers. Sounds like they're really going all in on making Smoke like as secure as possible. But I got to ask, what does this mean for us, like the everyday users? Are we going to notice our phones struggling to encrypt these messages?
That's a great question. And it actually brings us to another really fascinating aspect of Smoke, the echo protocol. But before we dive into that, maybe let's take a step back and talk about why. Cryptographers are so interested in Smoke in the first place, and its use of this McEliece algorithm.
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Why all the hype? Is it just about the quantum computer thing?
Well, it's definitely a big part of it, yeah. McEliece is considered one of the most promising candidates for this thing called post-quantum cryptography. But there's more to it than that. The fact that Smoke is implementing this really complex algorithm on a mobile platform, that's a big deal.
Yeah, so it's like we're taking this super advanced technology out of the lab and putting it right in our pockets. That's pretty cool. But I'm still curious about this echo protocol you mentioned. Like, how does that fit into all of this?
So the echo protocol is Smoke's way of making sure that messages are delivered securely and that both you and the person you're talking to actually have the correct encryption keys. So before your message is marked as read, the recipient's device sends back like a scrambled version or an echo of the message using their key.
So it's like a secret handshake to make sure both sides have the right credentials before they exchange any sensitive information.
Exactly. And secondly, the echo protocol also confirms that the message was actually delivered. You only see the message as read on your end once you received the correctly encrypted echo from the other person. This adds like a layer of certainty, especially when you're dealing with these really powerful encryption methods.
Okay, that's clever. So it's not just about making the message unreadable to outsiders. It's also about making sure it gets to the right person.
Right.
That both people can be confident in the security of the whole exchange.
Precisely. It's like a holistic approach to secure messaging. And it's one of the reasons why cryptographers are so excited about what Smoke is doing. It's not just about using a potentially quantum-resistant algorithm. It's about thoughtfully implementing it with features like this echo protocol.
So it's like combining a super strong lock with a really reliable delivery system. Okay, that makes sense. I got to ask, if McEliece is so great, why haven't we seen it used more widely? Like, why is Smoke one of the few apps out there using it?
That's a great question, and it kind of comes down to practicality and adoption. You see, McEliece uses much larger encryption keys compared to other methods like RSA, for example.
So it's like having this giant key for a tiny little lock seems a bit overkill, doesn't it?
Well, it might seem that way, but it's not overkill when you consider the threats we might be facing in the future with all this crazy computing power on the horizon. But yeah, those larger keys, they can pose challenges for storage and transmission, especially on mobile devices, which have limited resources.
Okay, so it's a trade-off then. Super strong security, but with some potential downsides. In terms of efficiency, are there any other considerations for users when it comes to McEliece? Like any downsides we should be aware of?
Well, one potential concern, especially with the larger keys, is the encryption and decryption speed. So while Textbrowser seems to have optimized Smoke for mobile performance, it's possible that on older devices. Yeah. Or if you have a bad internet connection, you might see some slight delays.
Okay, so something to keep in mind, especially if you're rocking an older phone or have a spotty connection. But overall, for someone who really prioritizes privacy and security, those trade-offs might be worth it. Right?
Absolutely. It's all about choosing the right tool for the job. If you're dealing with highly sensitive information, or you just want peace of mind, knowing that your messages are protected with some of the strongest cryptography out there, then Smoke is definitely worth checking out.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see why this app is generating so much buzz. It's like a glimpse into the future of secure communication. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's go back to the cryptography community for a minute. You're saying that researchers are really interested in McEliece and its potential. But are there any known vulnerabilities? Has anyone actually managed to crack the code yet?
That is a great question. And it takes us into the world of cryptographic attacks and how researchers are constantly trying to push the limits of these systems. Let's dive into some of the methods they use and see how McEliece has held up to the challenge. So remember those M and T parameters, they really are key to understanding how strong this McEliece algorithm is.
Right, those are the settings for how complex the code is, like you said.
Right.
But honestly, I still don't really get what they actually mean.
Okay, so M has to do with the size of that mathematical world the Gopa code works in. It's like the bigger the M, the bigger the playground for this complex maze we've been talking about. And that makes it harder to find your way through without the right key.
Okay, so bigger M means more security. Got it. But what about T? What does that one do?
T is all about error correction. It's like how many wrong turns or like fake paths on the treasure map the code can handle and still lead you to the treasure. A higher T means that even if someone tries to mess with the message along the way, it can still be decoded correctly.
So even if someone tries to, like, scramble the map, a high T means you can still find your way. That's pretty cool. But how does this all work in practice? If Smoke is using this super McEliece thing with these really high M and T values, like, will I even notice a difference when I'm using the app?
Yeah, that's a good question. In theory, those higher parameters do need more processing power to run, so it could affect things like, battery life or how fast messages are encrypted. But it seems like the developers at Textbrowser have found ways to optimize it.
So they found a way to make it run smoothly, even on a phone. That's a relief. But you mentioned this Echo protocol earlier and how that helps with security. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. The Echo protocol is a really clever way to solve a couple of problems in secure messaging. First, it makes sure that both you and the recipient have the right encryption keys. Before your message is marked as read, the recipient's device sends back like a garbled version of your message, an echo, if you will, but it's encrypted with their key.
So it's like they're proving they have the right key to unlock the message before you actually send the real thing.
Exactly. And the second thing it does is confirm that the message actually arrived. You only see the message as read on your end after you get the correct echo back from the other person. So it adds a level of certainty that you don't always get with other methods.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about hiding the message from outsiders. It's about making sure it gets to the right person and that both of you are confident it's secure.
Exactly. And that's why cryptographers are so excited about Smoke. It's not just about using a strong algorithm like McEliece. It's about how they've implemented it with features like this Echo protocol. It shows a real attention to detail and a commitment to security.
It sounds like they're really trying to cover all the bases. But if this McEliece algorithm is so great, why haven't more apps and services started using it?
Well, like I said before, there are some practical considerations. McEliece uses much bigger encryption keys compared to other methods like RSA.
Right, you said it was like having a huge key for a tiny lock.
Yeah, and those big keys can be a bit of a challenge, especially on mobile devices that don't have a lot of storage space. And it can take longer to send and receive those keys.
So there's a trade-off between security and efficiency. Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But is there anything else that users should keep in mind about McEliece? Any other potential downsides?
Well, one thing to consider is the encryption and decryption speed. Even though Textbrowser has done a lot of work to make Smoke run well on phones, you might still notice some delays, especially if you're using an older phone or have a slow internet connection.
Okay, so it's not a perfect solution, but for someone who's really concerned about privacy, those downsides might be worth it for the extra security.
I think that's a fair assessment. It really depends on your individual needs and priorities.
This is all fascinating stuff. I'm really starting to appreciate how much work goes into making our online communications secure, especially with the rise of quantum computers and all that.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex field. And Smoke's approach with McEliece is a great example of how developers are trying to stay ahead of the curve.
It's like they're building a digital fortress for the future. But before we get carried away, let's get back to the cryptography community for a minute. You said that researchers are really interested in McEliece and its potential. But are there any, known weaknesses? Like, has anyone actually managed to crack the code?
That's a really good question, and it brings us to a really interesting topic: cryptographic attacks. Researchers are always trying to find ways to break these systems, and they use some pretty clever methods. So let's take a look at some of those methods and see how McEliece has held up against them. Okay, so remember we were talking about how researchers are always trying to find ways to break these encryption systems?
Yeah, like they're trying to find weaknesses in this digital fortress that Smoke is building.
Exactly. And one of the ways they do that is with something called a structural attack.
Ooh, that sounds intense.
It's kind of like trying to find a fundamental flaw in the design of the castle itself. Like if they can figure out a way to exploit the way the GOPA code is structured, then they might be able to break the encryption without having to try every single key.
So it's more about outsmarting the system than just brute forcing it.
Right. It's like finding a secret back door into the castle.
But has anyone actually managed to do that with McEliece?
That's the amazing thing. Despite years of research, no one has found a practical way to launch a successful structural attack against McEliece.
Wow, so those castle walls are holding strong. But what about those brute force attacks where they just try every possible key combination? Wouldn't that eventually work? given enough time and computing power.
It's a valid concern, but McEliece has a pretty good defense against that too. Remember those huge key sizes we were talking about?
Yeah, the ones that are like having a giant key for a tiny lock.
Exactly. Those large keys make brute force attacks extremely difficult because the number of possible combinations is just astronomically huge. Even with the most powerful computers we have today, it would take an impractically long time to try them all.
So it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack the size of a planet.
Pretty much. But brute force and structural attacks aren't the only tricks up their sleeves. There's another category called side channel attacks, and those can be a bit more sneaky.
Side channel attacks, what are those?
So instead of attacking the algorithm itself, they try to find weaknesses in the way the system is implemented. It's like, instead of trying to break down the castle door, they look for a loose brick or an open window somewhere else.
So it's about finding those little implementation flaws that could compromise security.
Exactly. For example, they might analyze things like how long it takes the device to encrypt a message, or how much power it uses during the process. And by measuring these subtle variations, they might be able to glean information about the secret key.
Wow, that's some serious detective work.
It is, and it highlights why it's so important not just to have a strong algorithm, but also to implement it very carefully and to constantly test for and fix any potential vulnerabilities.
Well, this whole deep dive has been eye-opening. I feel like I have a much better understanding now of how much goes into keeping our digital lives secure, especially with all these new technologies emerging, like quantum computing.
It's definitely an exciting and ever-changing field, and Smoke's approach with McEliece is a fascinating example of how developers are rising to the challenge.
Yeah, it's like they're building a fortress for the future of privacy. But before we wrap things up, I have one last question that's been bugging me. How can we be sure that Smoke's implementation of Super McEliece is really as secure as they claim? Like, has it been independently verified or anything?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it's an ongoing process. The good news is that the cryptography community is incredibly thorough. They're constantly scrutinizing new systems, looking for any weaknesses, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
So it's like a constant peer review process.
Exactly. And that's how we make progress in this field, by constantly challenging each other and raising the bar for security.
Well, I feel like I've learned a ton today. We've explored Smoke, this intriguing mobile messenger. We've delved into the depths of the McEliece algorithm. And we've even touched on the world of cryptographic attacks.
It's been a pleasure diving into this with you.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay secure.